So here's how I look at it, like this idea that, again, the running premise of my program, this is like a cheat sheet for a lot of it. I mean, it's not the only thing I do, but this is one of the major themes I've been trying to explore along the way, is this idea that we're trying to violently stamp out differences.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to stop violence and work out the differences in a nonviolent space. That's the big switch that needs to happen as the cultural animus to unite us together, which is like, look, we have got to stop. And I mean violence and all of its forms of otherizing, of trying to, let's tax them, let's get them, let's steal money there, let's arrest them, let's persecute them, let's put them in a cage. We have to stop that. That doesn't mean for everything, murders and stuff, you can still have that, force for, but we
self-defense, just war, of course.
Yeah, we need to stop the normalization of violence to punt out unjust differences.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to, but right now, all the animating energy in the Western civic religion is towards hunting down differences with violence if necessary. Now, the reason why this happens, in my opinion, is you have to understand when Jesus says the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's in the other. We talked about people who have a different orientation or a different identity, gender identity, right? And how they're being marginalized by traditional differences of like, this is how you ought to be. Those things marginalizing them makes them feel the need to universalize and make their otherness the new norm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Jesus is talking about with the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, is that in the perception of being rejected, you become the cornerstone of power.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Well,
now you can do that the way, the way Christ does it, or you can hijack that framework of power and direct it back into a profane world of politics and coercion and subjugation. And that's what's happening there, because it's like, in the perception, because we're haunted by the cross, in the perception of the person who was on the margins, who didn't have 90% of people identifying as they do and acting as they do, and then they get persecuted and they don't have enough numbers to stand up for them and all that. In that persecution, in that rejection, it founds this energy of the culture to say, this is the new cornerstone. Mm-hmm. This is the new cornerstone by that persecution. So it feeds off of classical persecution and scapegoating and otherizing, and it builds a foundational cornerstone of power from that. And so the Christian result, the Christian answer, is to not play the game, is to not say, well, I'm going to go ahead and otherize them. Hey, you freak. Hey, you weirdo. Hey, you creeper. And even the groomer stuff plays sometimes into that and sometimes not.
Well, which is sometimes, like this idea. I think it's really, really important to, and again, this is just going to be an area of psychology that we're going to look back and wonder in astonishment of just how deranged we became once we realized that desire is mimetic. The sexualization of children in terms of giving to children the space in which they're told to adopt the kinds of desires within the full range of sexuality. And not to say that there's any problems with the adoption of any kinds of desires. Is a really horrific thing to do to children. I mean, children, before puberty, once puberty kicks in, there's a whole new spectrum of desires that open up for people. And then, showing people and talking about the range of those new kinds of desires, well, that's much more appropriate. But where they're at now in terms of putting this whole sexual ideology onto children is extremely damaging.
It is. But I'm trying to get into the mind of why they're saying this. They're haunted.
No, and for sure.
Cross.
And I don't want to get lost on that political instance from the more general theoretical point that you're making, which is I think you're right, the core of everything, which is. But one area where we have to be careful is that it's the divinity of war would say that the adoption of that victimage space as a political tool is quite the opposite from the divinity of truth. The stone that the builders rejected. I mean, you think the imagery here that Jesus is using, it's so amazing.
It's a misshapen stone.
Well, that and also, who's doing it? It's the builders. Well, when you look at our whole civilization, right? When Girard talks about how there's no culture without a tomb, and no tomb without a culture. And what is he critiquing the Pharisees for doing, but for building the tombs to the prophets that their fathers killed. It's the exact critique of this civilization building, which is founded upon the persecution and oppression of all these different kinds of
and
victims.
Founded on immurement, the actual literal entombment of live victims into the walls of the cities of the ancients. I mean,
which were set
which
up
is the cornerstone ritual. That's why he's saying it has become the cornerstone.
That's their sacred foundation. And so now he, on the cross, the crucifix, the cross becomes the symbol of our new kind of civilization, and that's the way that we have to go to. I see all of your work, all of your program is exactly this, cutting edge, tip of the spear. Even though it's in some ways it's sad that it's this that it's 2,000 years down the road of Christian history, and that it's still here as the tip of the spear. But I think you're right, is that it's showing that, but not allowing the rejected stone to become the new tomb that's attempting to be to be built. And I think,
but we got to understand. I want to have deep strategic empathy. Remember, I say strategic empathy. That doesn't mean I'm in deep solidarity or in agreement or trying to make a case for them, but I'm trying to say, from their standpoint, they are so saturated with Christian guilt and aesthetic or whatever. They're so haunted by that call of their culture. That when you say, hey, what we're doing there is completely wrong to kids, and they say, but look at this kid. Look at how they got picked on. They went on the bus, and they'll give you real world examples. So they'll take, in their mind, they're like, okay, you're in fairy tale theoretical world. Here's reality. This kid feels like they're not gender normative. And this boy is 7 and he's wearing a dress on the bus, and 4 kids punched him violently, and then he came home and his brother's mean to him, and he goes out in the playground and the other kids are picking on him, and that is creating severe trauma. And they're saying, I don't care about your theoretical Christian stuff. You're just trying to justify this kid feeling different and being persecuted, and you're trying to say that. And so they're saying, when they see that child who's putting on a dress and is a boy, they're saying that's the misshapen stone that's being rejected. And from that, I see Christ. From that, they're not saying that consciously, but subconsciously, they're feeling Christ's energy of righteousness there. And they're saying now that becomes the foundation. That's why they have a religious month of celebration of anybody in that space. So that's where they're coming from. And so the conservatives feed into that to keep it going, because they feed into the dialectical rivalry, which allows that never-ending impasse to keep building energy and martyrs energy for this new foundation. And we have to be like liberators of everybody. Christians need to be the peacemakers who come into that and try to like make peace. To stop the kids from being persecuted, but not to normalize it as now pick on people who identify as cisgender. Now that's a violent language to use. Cisgender makes that standard whatever feel other, right? Because the term cisgender feels weird and strange.
Well, it's a great example of just how nothing can be founded on the new kinds of differences that are being proposed. And it's, I wish that people would think more generally. Like, it's always been the case, not just in the case of sexual desires, but if you're different from the norm, if you're an outsider,
that's why they have like fat shaming and all that stuff,
right? But if you're different from the norm in any way, shape, or form, you tend to get picked on by everyone else who's not different from the norm, because you're a target for scapegoating by being different from the group in some way, shape, or form. And I wish
there's a deeply Christian impulse about that project. Though there is something we have to respect them about.
I just wish that it would be identified as a more general move, right? The recognition that that outsiders come in all different shapes and forms, and that being an outsider should be, it depends on the nature of what's being shunned, but there's so much dynamism and creativity that comes from outsiders in general, and then it's that more general a protection of outsiders, which is the protection of potential scapegoats as a Christianity. But it gets truncated to just this specific pattern of desire, and just this specific pattern of desire, because it goes against these other forms of differences which have been embedded in society before, and just because it's gonna upset the kinds of people who we want to upset with going
we'll know the liberals get it when they start championing the outsider who's a little bit of a country redneck in the middle of San Francisco school.
Right. Yes. You know? There you go.
Now we're like, now when we hear liberals talking like that, then we'll know they're finally getting it, right?
That's right. And you know, and the reverse is true too. Yeah. That you know, when you have conservatives who can be accepting and respecting respecting people as people.
Well, we're trying to do that right now. Let me give an example. Like there's a video clip that went viral. I think conservative media showed it, from a TikTok girl who says she's a very overweight girl, and she says, "I am a recipient of thin privilege," and she's very large, and she's like, "How could that be?" And then she's like, "Well, because there are people who are even double my size, as big as I am. And so in relationship to them, I am thin privileged. But if you're smaller than me, you are a recipient of thin privilege in relationship to me. And if you were a model size, you are a recipient of thin privilege." So there's and so these people are grasping in the dark for the insights of mimetic theory. You know, they're intuiting, that's right. They're moving along the way in the dark, because the thing is like, I was thinking when I saw that, I said, well, why do they have to use the word privilege? Privilege invokes like conflict. What would be better to say like an advantage? Like, you know, if I can, because she was saying I can go into an air, because she was saying when I go into a in a plane to fly, I have to get a seat belt extender, but I don't have to pay for 2 seats. So isn't that a great thing that I have thin privilege in relationship to someone who's bigger, who has to pay for two tickets to sit? And she said, "Isn't that, see, I'm a recipient of thin privilege." And then she said, "Well, somebody else who sits next to me, who doesn't have to get the seatbelt extender and feel the shame and all that, they have thin privilege in relationship to me." And I'm thinking, well, why don't you just say like advantages? You know, like that's an advantage, and that's advantage that, you know, you can sit into a seat and not have to feel embarrassed that you have to ask for 2 seats or a seat. But like they're trying to explore different shame levels that society has, right? And the conservative knee-jerk reaction is to say, "Oh, shut your yapping." You know what I mean? Shut your yapping and lose weight. That's not not really a Christian answer.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it might be. Yeah, I think so, because I mean, the Christian response, well, it might be a bit more compassionate than that, but it's something like, you know, you are called to take care of yourself. You are called to you know.
No, but you're what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make your point for you. You said they should universalize the different versions of people being misfits.
Yes, but I was just going to say, it's as a tangential point. It's funny too, because you know where privilege comes from, like historically, is that there was a privileged class of people, right? And this is, you know, this goes back to the differences that were maintained in, you know, in older societies. Is that there was a privileged class, right? But now we've largely eliminated the differences of class within our societies. So now we got to find privilege in all of in everywhere else that we could possibly look for it. So, you know, you have privilege in terms of like you said, in terms of economic capital, or in terms of beauty standards, or in terms of, you know, social. So
privilege you're not allowed to talk about is the actual real privilege, which is not really even wealth, but rather proximity to state power. You know? Like being in, how about Pfizer privilege? How about medical cartel privilege? How about military industrial complex privilege? You know, what about the Cheney privilege of being able to lecture the world about insurrections after making a career doing it around the world? You know, there's so many deeper real privileges where there's real violent consequences, and nobody's allowed to talk about that.
You're right. And my point was to say, you know, like in so many ways, how trivial our mimetic rivalry is socially is kicked up to such an extreme that we look for the most trivial differences in order to maintain our identity of opposition and to find someone to persecute and eliminate. And these differences are like these, like we talk about privilege as if they're ensconced in class distinction or something, like the way they were in archaic times, and they aren't anymore, right? But the counter examples that you make are there are points of real social privilege that are almost ensconced in terms of social differences that are very real.
So I want to give,
and that don't get enough attention, I don't think.
Right. And I just to land the point about what I'm trying to say there with that example of the the girl's feeling like she has thin privilege even though she's obese. But it's like that concept comes from this idea that when you take on the Christian vocation of trying to, get outside of the matrix of scapegoating and get into the world of like progress.
Growth. Yeah.
When you look at how Christianity, it's giving you a space to be able to innovate out of that matrix of violence. So when you look at this person like who's struggling with obesity, you don't say, hey, you are a snowflake. Really what you want to say is, as a Christian, we've discovered one of the reasons why people are having an epidemic of obesity is these products, vegetable oils. And that's using science to solve a problem that bypasses the dialectic between the conservative and the leftist. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, you all stop eating seed oils and obesity drops off of a cliff. Now that's Christian action, healing the environment to say, hey, look, you don't have to find sacredness in this distorted difference. And you don't have to ridicule this distorted difference. You can solve the problem in a healthy way. And it's a win-win for everybody. You know what I mean?
There's not going to be necessarily a technical solution to every single problem. And there are going to be, like, I mean, when you highlight the case of,
why does everybody always say that whenever you talk about technology? It's like there's this knee-jerk desire to say, hey, that's not going to solve everything. Why can't we talk about that?
Because
why is that so quaint and passe?
Well,
say that. I feel like a goofball every time I bring up, hey, let's solve cancer. Oh, it's stupid. That's not going to solve anything. Oh,
no.
All right.
There's lots of technological progress.
I feel like an old-fashioned.
It's
like,
it's so weird that
here?
It's so weird that it would feel old-fashioned to champion technology.
That's what I'm saying, though. It's like passe. I can't even. I feel embarrassed now. I feel like, my goodness, I keep trying to tell people to solve problems, and they're like, okay, yeah, we're just. I'm not saying you're that way. I just feel like that's the spirit of the age, you know.
Well, in some ways, yeah. But I mean, no, I think so. The seed oils in foods and all of the other kinds of ways in which obesity is artificially inflated and manufactured that could be otherwise as a result of change. Sure, but there's other cases of personal vice where it's going to be the exact same type of thing that we talked about in terms of the identity of love first. Is that okay? So first you recognize the person, and it might, like, I don't know how helpful it would be to go up and to tell a person, like, hey, you have this vice and you should correct yourself. That's probably not like what real creative charity is gonna go and do. But at the same time, you want to call out virtue as virtue and vice as vice, and to be able to say that maybe it's not the case of I'm a smoker. I love smoking, but I'm not going to say that, like, smoking's a great thing. And if someone was coming up to me and it was appropriate,
right.
the right time, the right place.
It's in a relationship. It's in a relationship. And they were able to say, like, it's not perfect, right? You could be better. You could be healthier. You can serve others more by doing it. I have to acknowledge the point. And so it's in a relationship of love that we should be able to have these
that's right is
personal
that
advice.
You put the identity of love first, and then you can talk about all the differences.
We don't get that in the culture where we get
differences first. And this is Girard's whole point with Clausewitz versus Pascal is we put the differences first, and then, like, maybe we'll get around to love later. Whereas the other way is you put love first, and then you can talk about whatever differences are real afterwards. And that's the only.
How do we have a relationship of love with these blue enclaves, so that we can tell them, hey, like, there's a lot of things that we feel when we're kids, but if we do life-altering things like hormones that can cause cancers and all kinds of horrible things, like, how do we have that relationship of love with those people so that we can talk about those things in a way that doesn't feel like you're imposing a religious view on them? That's kind of where they're at.
It's really challenging because, as societies, we set up forums where we're supposed to have these kinds of discussions. So we had politics as one, right, where you have a forum where you hammer out these differences, where you make your arguments, you make your case, and you try to persuade people. But it gets taken over by the party spirit or whatever, and it becomes just this war of opportunity. Then we have universities, and universities are supposed to be places where you go and investigate ideas, and you research, and you find new conclusions, and you conduct experiments, and you exchange ideas, and you have forums for debate. But they've all become monoliths, and they've become captured by theories and ideologies that are just demonstrably false, and can be shown where specifically they're demonstrably false, but are none. And there's a whole culture there that eliminates the possibility of alternative perspectives from being able to be actually authentically exchanged. There's some stuff that's just, it's interesting within university culture, because so much has to be stated with so carefully, just in terms of what's presented, or else it risks the forces of political correctness are so tight and so strong that there's a real risk from even the possibility of actually making, you have to nudge or make a gesture towards the kind of arguments that you would like to make, rather than actually being able to make the arguments you would really like to make, because you have to worry about your career and your reputation and your relationships with others. And so we don't have universities. We don't have politics. The internet was another place that maybe we could get out here and do this. And I think actually the internet is in many ways working better than these other platforms. But then at the same time, the internet is also very much driving closure towards even the possibility of hearing the other. So what do? It's a very large problem, and I don't know that. I like your solution, which is to connect locally with people. I think that's a great place to start. One
of the things about localism,
broadly, how do we do it at a social and cultural level without these institutions that were put there for this purpose? I don't know.
One of the things about localism that helps solve this problem is because it's bringing back healthy differences instead of policing them out, right? So everything I'm saying, we're policing out differences instead of policing out violence. And so if you flip that and say, okay, let's police out the violence and coercion, and let's not go after differences. Let's try to work on differences together. So that means instead of having a centralized national edict, one size fits all government from one city that's impenetrably enclosed by special interests, you break that power up and you say, look, it's like you and I. You might have the you and I might be cordial and friends, but if we had to be roommates and you leave AC super hot and I have it super cold, then we hate each other or something, But if we live in spatial differences, we can maintain cordial friendship, and that's the way we should think about liberals and so forth and so on. It's like, okay, and I know, but people on the right say no. They, and I say it too. They have an imperialist mindset. They won't allow you to have your local community with different values.
Well,
I don't know. We got to figure that out. But the point is like that's a way of saying, hey, look, DC wants one thermostat. How about we have multiple people have different homes, and we'll keep the thermostat at different places at the different homes. And that allows us to have a little bit of difference. And I know that's passé because everything's about uniformity and totality and, centralization and, imposing one standard. It's like, no, let's allow that difference. And guess what? That heals some of the violence. So that if somebody in California says, I don't really, but we see that happening right now because, they can't stand the thought that Clarence Thomas and others would bring that abortion issue back to the States. It's like, God forbid that, here in California, we'll be able to do it, but people in Alabama can't. I can't stand that thought. So there's that totality, that kind of imperialist mindset creeping back up, right?
Well, it's really interesting. There's a political principle called the principle of subsidiarity,
right?
And so it's usually held in tension with this other principle called solidarity. So solidarity is like, that's the union of everyone and everything together. So everyone looking at each other like models, and you have this kind of positive unity that's generated. That's solidarity. But then subsidiarity says that political questions or questions about law should be settled, or any kind of debate should be settled at the lowest relevant level. So some things, will be settled at the highest level. Like, no state's gonna allow murder or something like that, right? so there are, and this is how the United States was set
but you
up.
don't need to settle that at the highest level. It's so natural law that it's going to be settled at every level.
No, but like you can think of it. You can think of
that's how you're actually the founders intended it that way. That's why the abortion issue is supposed to be at the state and local level, because that's a matter of murder.
Well,
we don't have a national law that says can't kill. That's state law.
Well, it's interesting because
the more universal it is, the more local it actually is supposed to be. Like,
well, the abortion,
stealing, killing, and stuff like that. You know,
the abortion. It does. The abortion issue is it's so interesting when you're able to apply the Girardian lens to the abortion debate, because you see right away that it's a fight about victims. Right, you have one side. You have one side that says no, the victim is in every single case the woman, and the other side says no, there's two victims. There's a woman and a baby who might also be a woman.
And the other side says actually you're right, and if we allow this pregnancy to happen, then you're going to victimize that child in that terrible situation. So you do have two victims. So
it's very strange. But like once you apply the Girardian lens to it, you can see the psychological motor that's going in the case, right? And so it's one of the areas where there's been a lot of areas through the march of since the sexual revolution, where you could say that the right was really holding on to kind of losing arguments and losing debates. But the abortion one is interesting because if we really do believe in universal human rights, the fetus isn't anything other than a human. It's not a giraffe. It's not a hippopotamus. It's not a gazelle or anything else. It's a human. And so it's the one area where the right has actually really been on the side of social progress, once you can kind of understand what's going on in terms of the psychological motor and its relationship to universal human rights. So anyway, maybe that's a bad example, just given we were talking about abortion and murder, but there are things that can be settled at the highest level where it is the most appropriate. So
but it wasn't settled at the highest level. It was settled to go back to the local level. That's what.
Okay, well, don't be too dogmatic about it. There is the decision to go to war, for instance, right? The decision to go to war is a decision that you would make at the highest level. The decision to mandate, I don't know,
it's only in relationship
which side of the road you should drive on in the interstate system is going to be a decision that you can mandate at the highest level. It's not, there are decisions that you can do at the highest level, but those should be those situations are all should all be put through the filter of seeing whether or not this can be decided at either a local or a state or an intermediary a level first before it goes to that highest level. And that would be really wise. It would be really great to be able to get back to that. We've certainly departed from it on both the left and the right since about the 1960s or 70s, and it's great to see that there is right now a kind of a movement back towards subsidiarity as a proper
the founders
principle.
I'm just telling you the way the Federalist system was designed was that the things that were most intuitively what's the word? Self-evident, right? The self-evident concepts were to be handled at the state and local level. The idea of stealing and killing and things of that nature. The federal government was meant to basically, regulate the states interacting together and, trade within the states and trade with other powers and so forth. So the idea of war being something settled at the central level isn't because it's a matter of life or death. It's a matter of, is this party outside of us waging war on all of us, or is it waging war on just a county? If it's a county, it's probably a local insurrection, and that local group can handle it. You know what I mean? Well, so it's like proportionality to what the actual invasion is. You see what I mean? Like if it's a bank robbery, the local sheriff deals with it. If it's an uprising in Michigan, Whitmer would deal with it. The state capital.
If it's an invasion or a conflict with a sovereign state, then you have a declaration of war in which your sovereign state, which is the United States, is wholly involved.
Right.
And look at the way the Supreme Court is set up, right? There's the Constitution, and the Constitution applies to all of the states. And so if there's a law, the judicial system is largely set up under a principle of subsidiarity. At least that's how it's supposed to be set up. Right. If there's the Constitution is held to apply to the whole country, and so the states the questions that go to the Supreme Court are whether or not the state courts have determined something that is unconstitutional. So it really is something that is such an essential principle that would be great to really recapture. And I wish it was something that people taught in schools. But there's so many of these elements of natural law, which even the word natural law sounds so foreign to our ears. It's not something that we were ever taught in school, but it would be really amazing if we could recapture a lot of it, because it would show to people something that they already kind of intuit, and then it just goes under the label of common sense. So
right. I like this portion about violence in the sacred. Are these quotes from the book Violence in the Sacred, or these?
No, these are quotes from the text, wherein Girard is in the first one, he's showing Clausewitz's own interpretation of the divinity of war and saying, look, it really is violence of the sacred. He's saying, the violence is really where the sacrality lies. And he's got this nice part at the end where it's, Clausewitz could have seen war as something like a game, even an extraordinarily dangerous one. Instead, he saw it as an absolute. It was where everything was derived and came from. And then the second quote,
this is a really pretty quote. Read this one. I like this one. Or read whatever you like.
You read it. You read much better than I do. So you go ahead and read.
Well, I just think it's really good the way you took this quote out. This is from page 101 in Battling to the End.
Yep.
And he says, the Greeks never suggested we imitate the gods. They always say that Dionysus should be kept at a distance and that one should never get too close to him. Christ alone is approachable from this point of view. The Greeks had no model of transcendence to imitate. That was their problem. And it is the problem of archaic religions. For them, absolute violence is good only in cathartic memory and sacrificial repetition. However, in a world where the founding murder has disappeared, we have no choice but to imitate Christ, imitate him to the letter, do everything he says to do. The Passion reveals both mimeticism and the only way to remedy it. And this is interesting because I like to point out that passage that Paul talks about his conversion when Jesus confronts him on the road to persecution. And he says, it is hard for thee to kick against the pricks, right? And Jerry Boyer turned me on to this interpretation that would have been interpreted by Paul's Greek audience of elites that are listening to him. Why are you doing what you're doing? And they would have understood that as a quote from the Bacchae, from Dionysus.
Oh, really?
So Paul is quoting Jesus, quoting Dionysus, but he's redeeming the victims underneath the Dionysius matrix that the Greeks are sitting under, and he himself is sitting under by way of his zealous persecution of people in the way movement of Jesus to protect his transcendent God. He, in some sense, is basically saying, hey, just like you Greeks have the Dionysius cult that demands sacrificial victims, I too, in my zealous approach to understanding the true God, have been persecuting those same victims as you have in your different religion from mine, and that Jesus comes into that road of persecution and he says, hey, actually, I'm going to reverse the Bacchae play. In the Bacchae play, King Pentheus is putting Dionysus on trial, and Dionysus tells him, it is hard for thee to kick against the pricks, which is telling him, look, you think you've got me on trial here, but I'm actually the God here, right? And King Pentheus, in the end of the play, is torn apart by Dionysus's orgy of violence.
Wow, I never knew that it was actually a direct quote from the Bacchae. That's really
well. It was a saying that was popularized in the Bacchae, which was the most widely play at the time. So I just like that quote because I'm like, wow, it's so poetic because it's like, just read it again. Let me read it. It's what he's saying. The Greeks never suggested we imitate the gods. They always say that Dionysus should be kept at a distance, and that one should not get too close to him. But Christ alone is approachable. And I'm like, that's that passage.
Well, there's that.
Christ is quoting Dionysus to basically reverse what Dionysus is saying. Because in the King Pentheus, is King Pentheus on trial with putting a God on trial. And now Paul's basically saying, I was putting God on trial.
Yeah, that's right.
But my God says, hey, instead of tearing you apart, it's hard for thee to kick against the pricks, meaning you can't run from my love. You can't run from my grace. You can't run from my forgiveness for what you've done to my people. Dionysus's cult gets revenge on King Pentheus for persecuting Dionysus, but Jesus is reversing that. And he's saying, no, We're going to end this whole game. You can approach me. You can't approach Dionysus. You can approach me because I am saving someone who was persecuting my own body. And I'm healing him and I'm forgiving him and I'm bringing him into right relationship with those whom he persecuted, the saints. Isn't that beautiful?
It is extremely beautiful. And you can just, it just runs through the whole difference between, what the archaic societies had and, and their intuition of you can't imitate Dionysus. If you imitate Dionysus, you go mad, right? You go mad and the whole society falls apart.
But it shows Jesus' sovereignty over Dionysus, that he can take his quote and beat him from within,
Well, that's right.
And not to otherize Dionysus as the monster that needs to be vanquished, but to almost bring out the hidden victims behind the Dionysian cult. You know what I mean?
Well, and to reveal, when we're caught up in the persecutory frenzy, our own likeness to Dionysus, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not, and he's not rejecting us or throwing us away. He's inviting us into this new thing, which is the being that we were created to be and called to be, and that he's trying to draw us towards. So it's this whole everything within the archaic society, it just goes back to the truth and violence we were talking about. Within the archaic societies, it's all founded upon this lie and this misapprehension, whereas it's only when you enter into Christianity is reality disclosed and reality made possible. Otherwise we just wander around in our varying kinds of Dionysian frenzy or confusion.
Here's our small group Bible study point where we say, how have we in our lives been like Paul or Dionysus, right? That's the thing. That's Amen. How you have to take away. How have we been on the road of righteousness against our opponents like Paul, or in the case of King Pythias? King Pythias was doing the same thing. That's why Paul situates himself in his telling of what Jesus tells him.
That's right.
In King Pythias's role, he's saying, look, I was putting God on trial.
Well, I was
putting God on trial, and Dionysus is a god that tears his body apart from the Titans and then is reborn again. But it's interesting that in this telling, it's like Jesus's body was torn by his own creation and by Paul persecuting his own members of his body, like Stephen, by throwing stones at them, tearing their body apart. And it's like it's the healing of that Dionysian tearing apart and reborn as vengeance. You see what I mean?
Of course,
it's like, you've torn my body apart, but now I'm going to heal this relationship. It's beautiful. So that leads us to on the way of love. What does that mean as we conclude this chapter?
Yeah. So, I mean, on the way to the way of love, which
isn't there a song about that? Oh no, on the wings of love is the name.
Maybe, I don't know. But it was just my way of and I unfortunately for those watching or listening, they don't have the image from the slides in front of them. It was just the crucifix surrounded by a bunch of historical examples of victimage and violent revolutionary movements going on, wherein we're seeing that history is this ongoing struggle of tension between the totality of violence versus the new interruption of truth within and which upsets that false totality. So the whole march of history is instead this way towards the way, capital W, of love. And so it's meant to bring everything together, where it's like, it's not the critique of postmodernism against modernism or against the Enlightenment, which was that the Enlightenment was always trying to give this totalizing theoretical vision, whether it be through political philosophy or through even the totality of different theories that would be offered. And these kinds of totalities, especially in the realm of anthropology or political philosophy, always neglect the violent foundations that go into those societies and neglect the discovery of anthropology, from which an actual political philosophy can actually be done. And the Enlightenment tried to say that it was being enlightened precisely on the basis of its rejection of religion, whereas what the mimetic theory illustrates for us is that we actually discover or can only become rational what in making the discovery that we are religious beings, and that we inhabit a religious universe and a religious space. So this is very important in terms of an ongoing discussion throughout the text of the nature of, if you like, between philosophy and theology, or philosophy and anthropology and theology. So which is an area of looking at Girard that I personally am very interested in.
Totality or mythology creates false differences in service to the dual. We've been talking about that with social justice and other totality ideologies, totalism. These are false from the point of view of seeing another as another like myself. Identity, the unleashing of violence, paradoxically makes seeing the similarity, especially from the outside, easier since it's more explicit. It's what you say as a point.
Yeah, so the escalation to extremes, and this is what we're going to see in the next chapter, in chapter 5, creates the possibility for some hope, since the escalation to extremes makes the violence able to be seen as violence that much more easily. So you can't hide the violence when the violence becomes more and more explicit. And so it's from that point that it's perhaps the most obvious that one can make the jump from that way of being to a totally different and other way of being. And so now, in our present world, we don't have recourse to the kinds of mythologies of the past. And there was all kinds of different mythologies. You can think of even like the racial mythologies of the 19th and mid 20th century. But we've recognized these as mythologies that are simply attempting to deny the fact that we were all created in the image and likeness of God and share an identity with each other. So violence is a more and more difficult time, since it has to either find ever increasing ways to disguise itself and to hide itself, or if it really comes out, then people see it as violence and it can be shown, and the leap can be made and undone. But hopefully this leap can be made before violence wins through, or wins by causing by bringing out the destruction.
I think that's the fundamental mistake of some of this neo-pagan right-wing stuff, reactionary stuff about trying to, oh yeah, if we just do irony, we can bring back, strong man violence or something, and that's going to solve the problems. I think that totally doesn't understand where history's going and where it came from.
Yeah, well, and it's also a problem too, since, and this is just the next quote on the slide, is that these are the kinds of heroic models that totalitarian regimes set up. But the problem is that if you set that up as the model for imitation, well, then everyone else moves to imitate that same model, and because that model is always desiring a thing that can't be shared, namely to be superior, then it constantly is set to war with itself. Now, again, I think this is really important to balance with what we talked about in terms of the identity of love. Is as long as you start with the identity of love, then you can have all of the other kinds of differences afterwards. So it's not wrong to try to improve yourself, or to win contests, or to try to make it in the world and all of in the traditional ways, but you just can't put that over and above everything else without losing everything else.
It would be idolatry in a Christian.
It would be idolatry. It would be a false form of sacrality. It would be everything that we've been warned against in terms of spiritual perversion.
So the heroic model is a throwback to the kind of Nietzschean model, right?
That's right. The heroic model and the Nietzschean model, you could say, are the same thing. Now, again, this is the false form of heroism, and actually, what Girard is attempting to develop through the text is a true form of heroism, which I think he does pretty successfully by the end. So, yes, for people who are listening, it wouldn't be don't be too misled by the terminology, and sometimes that can happen in Girard.
Right. Yeah. Because people, there is a good kind of hero.
There's a good kind of heroism. Yes,
the Christian hero.
Well, and there's a heroism.
But too many people who want to imitate Christ tell me you got to imitate Constantine to get to Christ, and I don't like that. I don't think that's the right path.
Well, I mean, it's more of the question of what does Constantine. There's parts of Constantine that I think you can imitate quite well, and I think there's parts of Constantine that are pretty important, and I think there's other parts of Constantine that can be pretty openly critiqued. But it's this fundamental war between truth and violence. And actually the move that Constantine makes is that first move where, for the first time, political power is internalizes Christianity, adopts it officially, and that's where the real social transformation starts to begin really dynamically. So I would be on the side that doesn't want to idolize Constantine too much, but also wouldn't want to be with those Christians who say that, you know, Constantine was the source of all of the problems either.
I wasn't saying either, but
Yeah.
Jean-Michel Ugorlian told me that he doesn't believe that the Bible wants us to imitate Jesus, but to follow him. And he thinks there's a distinction between following Jesus and imitating Jesus. And I just wanted to know what you broadly think of that idea as a distinction to be made.
Yeah, it's really weird. I think that's a distinction without a difference in the first place. And then in the second place, I think it's weird because Jesus explicitly says, imitate me. So I don't know where he's deriving that from, or what he means by it. Maybe he's got a paper, and I shouldn't just respond in that way, actually, because he's a sophisticated thinker. But
I was just wanting to know if you thought about any distinctions there, broadly speaking. If not, we can think.
No, I can't think of anything. Jesus is the model who we can imitate, and in imitating him, we are linked to the Father, and it's his way that we can adopt without being brought into conflict with one another.
I think that the error tends to go in too much of this idea of not trying to imitate Jesus, but to rather kind of objectify Jesus as just another big other god to worship in the traditional sense of hero worship and other gods of, you know, the antiquity. Because it's like, instead of making Jesus's life the subject of our life, to want to become and to live in and act the way he acts, there's a more of a focus on, he did all that perfect stuff, and I say my prayers and eat my vitamins and give him, you know what I mean? It's kind of like, hey, you're the man. I'll keep being a jerk and a selfish guy.
Mm-hmm.
And there's people off in the road. I'm going to get mine, and I'm going to live free or die. You know, that kind of attitude of like, but I'll give my hat to the perfect one, and you did it great, and I'll try to be a little nicer. But it's like, no, that's really not at all the point. The point is not to objectify him as just the new big other god to pay your tithe and tip your hat to as the man, but rather to become the man, to be him. Right. And
I think that's right. I would only object to the live free or die bit. I think that's totally fine. But
I was just saying in a cartoonish sense of how it gets used as like, I can do whatever I want as long as I'm not bothering somebody else.
For sure.
I am the employer, and I can not give my employees this type of, you know what I mean? Because it's my business, and
for sure.
Write my tithe to Jesus, and I get away. And it's like, no, that's not at all the point. Right?
No, for sure. And there's Christianity as an identity politics, right? There's Christians who set to war with each other over their own confessional differences, and there's using Jesus as a heroic model to go and to beat up on other people with, or to treat them badly, or so basically to not act like Jesus, exactly like you said. And so that kind of thing, of course, is a kind of can be a kind of vice if it's making us act in ways that aren't Christian. And you're right to say that it's really about becoming like him. But yeah, I don't understand the difference specifically between following and imitating. I think it would be basically the same.
I think in broad terms that all the mistake. This is just I'm laying another card on the table. The reason why I'm saying these things is I think another reason why the nihilistic left has gotten so much cultural currency is precisely because the traditional conservative, pious ones in all different denominations, Catholic, whatever, Protestant in America, have not taken the call to imitate Jesus's peacemaking and nonviolence and reciprocal love and mercy. We don't take that to heart as the primary means of worshiping Jesus, but rather we have this objectified Jesus that you sing heroic songs together about. How great and wonderful are you? You saved us. I can keep kind of being in this neutral space of living in which everything's kind of gray, and you can kind of take the Bible and twist it to justify this kind of deal and that kind of raw deal. And I think that's precisely where the nihilistic culture has gotten its currency, because it's in those moments where people were going to church on Sunday, and the day before they were parading an African American around the streets in the same way Jesus was paraded around, and then killing him. And it's like in those moments you create this demonic rippling effect that is still hurting and cursing our society, right? You know what I mean? I'm thinking of the 1920s when people go to church and they'd read a passage about Jesus being paraded around with a cross of thorns, with a purple robe. And yet they just the day before had a lynching, and where they did a mock parade of this victim, right? And they pretended that he was a king before they killed him. Those are documented cases in American history. And it's like, that just happened in the grand scheme of history's scope. That just happened. It's just a few decades ago in some sense, 100 years ago, I guess by now, but in some cases, but it's like, in terms of the ones I'm thinking of, particularly like a case, I think it was in Missouri, where they paraded this man around in a mock ceremony, like he's a king, and then they killed him in the most brutal way. And it's like, it's those things that the left is rightly tapping into and saying, what horror is this? What tragedy? Why can't you deal with this? And it's like, that's a prophetic critique. And the conservative priestly answer to say, shut up, that's in the past. That's not the right answer, and it's like, that doesn't solve the problem. And the Christian has to come in like surgery as a peacemaker and try to sort this stuff out, to be like, no, I mean,
well, so I think it's definitely right that a lot of what gets used in terms of the psychological motivation of the grievance against Christianity is Christians not behaving like Christians in the past.
Not just grievance against Christianity, but grievance against all traditional boundaries and difference. That's what I'm saying.
That's right. So using that, but I think that at the same time, that's just another kind of scapegoat, right? That they're not acknowledging, like, all of the good, like, so where is the
right? They're chastising their ancestors as if we would have done better, right?
Where is the acknowledgement of the thousands of Christian hospitals that were made, and the tens of and hundreds of thousands of hours of work that people poured in terms of free charitable labor to actually work to save lives and to heal people, or educational institutions to the tens of thousands that were founded? Where's the appreciation of all of these different elements of everything good that the church has done for all of society and civilization? Where is the appreciation of perhaps approaching the church's teaching to inquire as to whether or not there might be actually any wisdom to the kinds of rules and differences that she has imparted or laid down? No, all of this is instead taking the instances of scandal, and they are real, and the instances where Christians have failed to act like Christians, and to attempt to use that as a basis from which to then go on and persecute and destroy this other thing which they see as getting in the way of their more basic desires.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that I'm trying to help people understand. My audience tends to be not leftist, I'm imagining, And so I'm trying to help them understand where the leftist mind gets excited about this stuff, right? What I mean by leftist mind, I don't mean someone who's an activist or an elite who's using this to get revenge. I'm talking about the average people in the middle, the moderate middle that watch these movies and documentaries and stuff made by a liberal worldview, and they're like, I don't understand why my Christian conservative friend is mad about this. And I'm trying to enter into that space and to show them the feeling of why the average moderate normie is going towards the leftist trajectory in history. It's because they're tapping into a real painful reality that needs to be reckoned with, which is, like you said, we should know better. If it's 1930, it's 1930 years from Christ. You would expect you've had 1,930 years or whatever to like sort these ideas out. And as a pastor, you should be telling me, if I see any single person in my church at a mob, you're out. And I'm, you know what I mean? Like you should have had that figured out by now. Now I know you can always say, well, yeah, if it's easy for you to say, because it's been 100 years from now for you to think back at that. But the point is, it was still 1,930 years from when Jesus said those words that people had the opportunity to say, hey, you know what? I don't think, after I just heard the gospel reading today saying that they persecuted Christ and they paraded around as a mock king, I don't think that's a good idea to do that.
Well, you would think,
and I don't care what the accusations of the heinous crimes are, but that's the thing, suspicion.
You would have thought that it would have penetrated more deeply.
But we weren't there, and therefore we
weren't there. we should have been there, especially by then, and maybe at that time in 1930 we were actually finally kind of getting there, but still we hadn't been there for what had almost been 2,000 years before that. But unfortunately, I think the dynamic that goes on in terms, so absolutely, call attention to all of the egregious abuses, but they don't seem to call attention to much else, and they don't seem to ever show any of the good. So I think but
they only do that because the right reacts and says, no, it's not that big of a deal.
I really think the psychological motor isn't that complicated. It's simply that Jesus says things that from the point of view of my desire, I don't like. And then I can show an example of the violence that is contained within Christianity, because Christianity has taught the whole culture that violence is bad and that victims are good. And then I can use that as an example to show that Christians and the church and Jesus is no good. And then I can support my own desires. And I really actually think that, especially in Hollywood and in the places where movies are made, in a lot of other, in terms of, the more highly educated elite liberals, I really think that's actually.
I agree with that. But what about the normie who goes to a left-leaning church, who understands that humans are sinful and understands that Jesus is good, but still goes to the SJW political causes just as zealously as them? So I'm trying to understand where they're getting that moral orientation, right? And I'm trying to enter into that space so that I can help show them where maybe that's going the wrong way, and also show their conservative counterpart, hey, they're not just an other. They're not just joining this SJW campaign because they've got a sin that Jesus condemns and they want to justify it by pointing out, racial oppression in the past. That sometimes there might be actual currency to that feeling that there hasn't been enough attention to this recent point in our history. Not that it's right to fixate on the guilt, but rather to just acknowledge that it happened, because a lot of normies don't even know what happened. They don't even know what a continent is. So when they hear that there was this Tulsa massacre, they're like, whoa, does that make sense?
It does. And I mean, it's strange because
it's like a horror. Holy crap. I never heard that in my history books. This is a cover up. It feels like that, which is, they're getting that from Christianity, which is all about finding the victims under the textbooks and so forth. Right.
And I don't want to say, and I would certainly never want to say that a lot of their motivations aren't coming from a point of genuine righteous indignation over the kinds of abuses that have actually taken place in the past. I guess where I get so worn down and tired of it is that, first of all, it's a lot of the time it's not put in a very relative context. A lot of the time, the historical context is often left out, and that we often judge the past by the standards of the present, which is quite egregious in a lot of cases. And so much of what you see in terms of left and right is competition of which victims are we going to showcase. So, for instance, we talk about one side wants to talk about, take your pick in terms of whichever victimage group the left wants to hold up. And because there's a lot more attention within media and within academia and the way the textbook, you don't hear a lot about, say, the victims of communism. I mean, you did more in the States than in other places, but you don't hear about so much about the Gulag system or the Maoist revolutions or Cambodia. You hear about them, but you don't. But those victims don't get shown. The victims of the atheist, which were mostly communist dictatorships in the 20th century, those don't get shown and held up and portrayed. And what you do get over and over and over and over again is this very tiresome and very wearisome story about, well, here's this Judeo-Christian patriarchal institutions and sets of differences that were established, and look at how brutal and oppressive and tyrannical they were, and look at how much we need to subvert them by showing people stories who can act exceptionally outside of those boundaries, and how much more free and liberated we are as a result of trampling down and destroying this thing which has served as the spiritual foundation which enabled the possible. And so all of it's very Christian in the sense that it's critiquing the violence that went into the foundations of the civilization in the first place. It's just right now, it really has reached an extreme fever pitch where we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater, and the capacity that the church at its best used to give us in terms of the ability to lexically order or prioritize different cases of victimage. So, for instance, starvation or letting people starve to death that's actually worse than people not being able to live out their sexual fantasies in the way that they might see
Who's
fit.
being starved to death in this?
Well, you can think of, they're like right now we're facing the threat of famine from war and that's going on in Ukraine. 20 million people are
Yeah.
but we spend a lot more time fixated on, our particular culture war, immediate,
right, but,
and even and look, hey, even
you're totally right.
Even we're guilty of it right now. So
we're all on the same page. I'm just trying to show people how we can deeply walk into the shoes of the normie who's being persuaded to go along with these big mainstream narratives and help them go in there with them and then get them out.
Yeah, no, for sure.
You know what I mean?
Well,
because if you just say, hey, you're just part of that group that doesn't understand starving kids because you're into gay stuff, then they're going to be like, well, I don't understand that. So you got to go in there and say, okay, the reason why it feels this way is because this is a real thing. That's a real thing. Let's try to get our orientation back. You're trying to wake people up back to sanity, right?
Well, David, what we really need to get our hands on is like a Hollywood-sized budget and production crew, and to be able to get great story writers to be able to tell much more creative and dynamic and informative stories. If you think about and I know everything, like it's exactly what you're trying to do on your program, which is to take Girard stuff, get it down to these simple principles, and then give these to people, because once they have them, all of these kinds of false oppositions fall away and people realize what they're caught up in, and everything ends up being totally transformed in a really creative way, which really does transcend, like the left-right political dichotomies and everything, which is very, very powerful. But unfortunately, we don't have those Hollywood resources. So hopefully,
well, the thing is that like,
we can get them somehow.
See, you said the right has their victims, like the working class, and
yeah,
the gun owner,
which is weird because that used to be the left, but anyway, yeah, that's right.
The conservative, the gun owner, that's a victim class, right? Because that's a person who is being unfairly, persecuted,
or the person who's locked in their home from a health order or whatever, right? They can't go, or they can't be at their dying grandparents' bedside because the state mandated that it was unsafe for them to be able to be there at the hour of death for their loved one, from a virus which had I don't know what the mortality rate ended up being, or it was showing that the lockdowns and the masking and the vaccines had an overall 0.2% effectiveness rate in lowering the death. Sorry.
Go. Sorry.
But it's not the gun owner might not be the case of the victim that's obvious, but the health dictatorship, there's an obvious victim case where
the gun owner is a victim, because every time there's a shooting, they're scapegoated as you did this because
for sure, no, 100%. It's just intuitively it's maybe not as obvious as the health order that says you can't be at the
right. Yeah, that's a physical. You're trapped.
Yeah.
But how do we, this is an open question I'm asking you, is like, how do we tell those victims perspectives without getting into a mimetic competition of the left's, well, you've got your victims, well, here's our victims. Well, now you're at an impasse. You're at a mimetic, you're in the supremacy of victory rather than the supremacy of the duel, right? Or the rivalry. You see what I mean?
Well, it's interesting because I do. Well, this is the whole problem is and certainly the problem that we face, where it's like, well, first of all, if you start with right and left and not with, the person on the other side. So if you're having a conversation with a stereotype identity, it's much more difficult not to fall into the difference debate and language and posture. It's very different when you're sitting down with someone with a name and a face who's sitting across from you and exchanging ideas. And what you find is automatically you're more in a space where you're dealing first with a person and then with whatever the disputes over the victimage case are. I think as I'm in a certain sense, when things go up to a mass level, I'm always a bit more pessimistic, but I'm very optimistic about the potential for human reason, kind of. That's
what my show is. It's an experiment as to whether you can take this kind of message that tries to get people to see how victims that the left point out and victims that the right point out both are getting persecuted, and both also can transcend that persecution resentment matrix. And I'm trying to experiment to see whether that can actually succeed as a mass media.
Well, Jesus
entity. You see what I mean?
Jesus,
because you said it's easy to do one-on-one, but it's harder to do on a mass. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I'm trying to do it as a living, and kind of hard to catch on in that sense of like, well, maybe it's not, but you know what I mean? It's like, it's an experiment and it's ongoing. I don't know yet.
For sure. I really think that, you know, Jesus's solution to this was to get everyone to come into church. And that's, you know, that's kind of gone, with mixed results throughout history. I think much more overwhelmingly positive than negative. But that really is the solution, is to come into church, to hear the gospel, to be transformed and to be like him. And that is really the only real solution for being able to get over, you know, our divides. And it used to be that we had this, you know, this shared spiritual framework that we all kind of agreed upon. But now, with the way that history is unfolding, we've lost a lot of that shared underlying place of agreement. And there's some benefits to that, but there's also some real drawbacks which call into question whether or not there's a kind of basic unity that will be able to hold things together, or even to be able to replicate into the future as in relation to some other things.
So this is where you would maybe part ways with like a Peterson approach, or that's popular online, about like, you know, you don't have to necessarily believe in God, but you need to act like he does. You would say, no, you actually need to be born again to truly get away from this dialectical battle of rivalry and my victim versus your victim. It's not enough to just intellectually come to the conclusion, I don't know if there's a God, but I'm going to live rightly and beautifully as Christ in an abstract sense. You're saying, no, you need to actually have that born again encounter with Christ through the church or whatever.
I would look at it hierarchically. So I would say that, you know, it's all about participation in, if you like, God's desire, right? And the way in which that he's called us to be. So, you know, Peterson's approach, it's better than something like, well, I don't care, I'm in rebellion with everybody, screw everything, or, you know, there's all of these problems in society, so we have to burn down all of society in order to, as a result, you know, out of this one scandal. It's better than that. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. Things can be better. But then even going to church isn't perfect, because you can go to church and still be quite far from living like Jesus. So it's a hierarchy of participation, and so we're invited to go ever more and ever deeper, both in this world and in the world to come.
You know, you talk about the failure of Schmitt to regarding the law to contain. Can you get into that a little bit, just briefly?
Yes.
So complex that too long?
Well, it's like, you know, first we have to kind of explain who Schmitt is and what Schmitt's ideas are. So I mean, Schmitt basically is dealing with, in particular, he's looking at partisans, right, and seeing how, you know, partisans are a problem from the point of view of the state. So you have this designation of partisans as terrorists, and so Schmitt sees that you need to be able to designate people as friends and enemies, but if you designate, but even in the designation of them as enemies creates conditions wherein you get uprisings of enemies within, and the disintegration of the attempt of law to hold things together. If you designate people as enemies, and set up everything in terms of a friend-enemy distinction, then you return to the heroic model, which sets up this rivalry of opposition, in which case the law, which is supposed to contain the conflict and suspend it from taking place, is actually worn away, because it's the primacy of victory over everything else. So there's a big critique of there's an acknowledgement of what Schmitt was trying to do in terms of recognizing the problem, but that won't actually solve the problem. It's one more false kind of totality, where actually it's an attempt to draw totality out of the dual. But yeah,
Schmitt's just uncovering a process of how, you know, you're going to have endless schism all the way down in the absence of a unanimous myth that people can believe, right?
Well, yeah, Schmitt, and well, that's more Strauss following after Schmitt. But yes, Schmitt definitely believed the same thing in terms of the necessity of some kind of underlying spiritual foundation on which things can be based. And at least in that respect, I think that that it's something worth thinking about.
So you have this quote here to end this: not only can the duel no longer be an institution, but it is what all institutions have tried to dissimulate in order not to disappear. We can even say that institutions are held together only by resistance to the emergence of the duel. And so in Clausewitz's day, war was still an institution. It was codified and controlled by politics, or at least he pretended to believe it still hid the principle of reciprocity to some extent. This is why Clausewitz sees the escalation of the duel, the confrontation between two nations that go from hostile intent to hostile feeling, but refuses to take his thought about this trend to its logical conclusion, the pathology of national interest to which it leads.
Mm-hmm.
What's the pathology of national interest?
Well, that's just the pathology of the totalitarian model, which seeks supremacy over everyone and everything else, which is just the further escalation towards extreme. So this is Girard just critiquing Clausewitz's notion that he thought that, you know, so Clausewitz sees originally the escalation to extremes in seeing war as a duel, but then he backs down from that and says, no, politics can control war, and you know the state can direct war into the direction that it wants to go, and you can have this kind of rational pursuit of national interest. But instead, what Girard says is, no, you're getting much closer when you recognize that this simply leads to is the escalation to extremes. And then so the deeper point though is that, and this is, you know, we're talking about politics, we're talking about left and right, and we're talking about all of the different kinds of difficulties in terms of the preference of victims, and I do think that they're actual objects of the truth that you can get right or get wrong. I don't think that those disputes are without foundation in a lot of cases. But you know, what's the real problem? The real problem that the gospel has unleashed is the violence that goes into all of our institutions, that they're all based on different kinds of exclusion or elimination or on victims that are unacknowledged. And how do we really
gospels deal with unleash that, or is it just our failure to obey the gospels?
No, that's what the gospels have done. The gospels have the gospels have shown that, you know, even something like
they've shown the violence, but they haven't unleashed more violence. It's our disavow, it's our ability to imitate Christ that is unleashing more opportunities for violence. I just want to make that clear.
It's not God's violence that's unleashed, but rather
it's our but it wasn't
our
Christ.
Violence. It's our violence that is like we could always at everywhere and at every opportunity choose to follow Jesus, but we haven't, right? We've chosen to follow the other opposed spirit instead, and so it's our responsibility, but that is the real problem that we have to confront is this revelation of the violence that goes into our institutions. And because we don't want to look at this basic problem and come into the way of love, we look in every other possible way in which we can blame the opposing force in the same institution instead, rather than, you know, the root of the problem itself.
That's the problem with all nations is they can't admit they're part of the problem. You know?
That's right, and no national interest will admit it. And so, you know, and this kind of
why don't we have Obama talking about, you know what, I apologize to America in some sense, but I want to apologize for what I did in Libya. I want to, you know what I mean, or Trump apologize for killing people wrongly, or sanctioning Iranians and starving them for the sins of their regime. These things, you mean, there's no recognition of the real reality of the violence of these states, these nations.
Well, that's
I guess that's why they're a nation. I mean, it's like asking mafia people to, hey, acknowledge that you shouldn't have whacked that guy that was intruding on your turf. I mean, it's like
that's right. And you know, when we get towards the end of the text, we'll start to see Girard talking about the idea of Europe, and by Europe he means the West, and by West he means the positive part of the Christianized globe, where it's like where it's not where it's like, but where you know, this thing can pop up anytime, wherein a nation or a people or an individual will say, look, you know, I'm responsible for this thing, and I was wrong, and you know, I apologize. And the response to that isn't, you know, more violence to try to go after that person, but instead just, you know, the acceptance of the apology and forgiveness. And if we can get there in all the way through from the highest heights of all of our nations and institutions, and all the way around the world, and into all the lowest places, you know, then we'll be imitating the rule of the kingdom and find ourselves in a whole new kind of world in which we can occupy.
Yeah, and then next chapter you say, rather than the Gospels within history, all of history is set within the Gospels. So we'll leave it there as a cliffhanger, what that means.
That sounds great. No, thank you, David. Always a pleasure.